I was misled. I was tempted by a harlot. I was weak, and I allowed myself to be fooled by an evil woman. She led me from the path of righteousness. I know that you will deal with her someday.
Imagine this. A man sits alone in a concrete cell, the kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room. It presses against the skull. The world outside has forgotten him, but he hasn't forgotten the world. Not the headlines, not the judgment, not the faces of the family he destroyed. And yet, instead of remorse spilling onto the page, something else begins to drip from his pen. Imagine opening a letter from a convicted murderer. Not one begging for forgiveness, not one accepting the full weight of what he did, but a letter twisting the story. A letter blaming the very women whose lives intersected with his own. A letter speaking of temptation, pressure, and emotional traps, as though he were a man swept away rather than a man who made a choice. These aren't rumors whispered in the dark. They're words attributed to Chris Watts in letters described by major news outlets. Words that attempt to reshape a narrative the courts have already carved into stone. Imagine reading lines where he paints himself as overwhelmed, oppressed, misled, tempted. Imagine a man who took everything still reaching for a way to cast himself as the one who fell, not the one who pushed. And imagine, for a moment, how those letters must have felt to the victims' families. The reopening of an old wound they never asked to revisit. But this is where our story begins. Not with a murder, but with a rewrite. An unsettling attempt to shift fault, soften guilt, and rewrite the emotional truth of a crime the world will never forget. Welcome to True Crime Log. And if you're ready to follow the story from its first letter to its last breath, stay with me.
The women in his life are to blame. The Daily Mail just got its hands on some letters written by Watts at the Dodge Correctional Institute. That is a maximum security prison in central Wisconsin, where he was sent, and he has been there for the last 6 years. The letters show a man determined to find anyone but himself responsible for his diabolical behavior. He actually addressed his letters to God, zip code unknown. And he first unloads on his mistress, Nicole Kessinger, writing this. I was misled. I was tempted by a harlot. I was weak, and I allowed myself to be fooled by an evil woman. She led me from the path of righteousness. I know that you will deal with her someday. She will be judged. You know my heart, Lord. I am a man after your heart. I seek your face. I allowed her to sway me. FYI, Nicole Kessinger told the police that she was dating a man who told her that he was separated and divorcing. But then when his wife and children disappeared, she got very scared and she called the police immediately, leading to his arrest. But Watts doesn't stop with Nicole Kessinger. No. He unloads on other women too, mostly unnamed women, calling them harlots and Jezebels and whores. And of course, he blames his pregnant wife for being domineering and self-absorbed, suggesting that she caused her own death. I think I just threw up in my mouth. What is weird is that he doesn't seem to have it in for all women, because plenty of his letters are addressed to female pen pals. And get this, he seems to be looking for a new wife. My next guest broke this story. Steve Helling is a senior reporter with the Daily Mail. He is top-notch in true crime. He's a friend of the show, and he's a good friend of mine. Steve, I should have called you for a drink before you came on the air, as opposed to going for drinks after work, because I couldn't unclench my teeth while reading your piece. So just start with what else you've got on what he writes about women.
I should have warned you, first of all. Let's start there.
Yeah.
I got my hands on these letters. I've seen a lot of his letters. I know his handwriting. I know his writing style. And the thing about Chris Watts is that he couches everything that he writes in this spiritual Christianity type of thing that isn't like any Christianity that I know, that basically he doesn't take personal responsibility. He was always tempted. He was always weak. Somebody was always pulling him aside, and that somebody was always a woman. She was a whore. She was a harlot. She tempted me with her soft words and with her lips. It makes me think, can you take any responsibility whatsoever for what you did? And it seems like you can't.
Turns out no. Yeah, so he says in a letter that you got your hands on, quote, "The lips of an immoral woman may be smooth, but no amount of paint on her face can disguise her evil heart." So now I guess it's the makeup's fault for what he did. But he doesn't seem to hate all women. He seems to really want a new one. What is the story about the search for a wife? Is there anybody who's actually interested?
Well, I mean, we see this all the time. Chris Watts is not a bad-looking person. And, there's always going to be somebody who's interested in him. And so there are women that write to him, and he writes back. He's actually very good at corresponding. And of course, a lot of the times he's just talking about, it's a lot of spiritual stuff that he talks about, a lot of Christianity, a lot of God, a lot of Jesus. But then, he'll sometimes talk about himself and be like, I'm misunderstood. And, I was a good father. I was a good person until something happened. But I'm still a good person. So, it's interesting what he'll say to these women. And, a lot of these women, they do fall for it. They do think, well, maybe he's changed. Maybe he's a better person than I thought he was.
I want to pop that piece back up there. We just had it up on the screen, but I want to read it. It was this business about being a good person. I'm barfing in my mouth. He says, "I was a good husband and father."
It started with a letter that wasn't meant to travel far. A handwritten message passed from a prison cell in Wisconsin into the hands of someone willing to listen. The paper itself carried nothing unusual, but the words felt like an echo from the past. A familiar tone Chris Watts had carried long before the world knew his name. He wrote with the same calmness that startled detectives in 2018, a steady, almost gentle rhythm that sharply contrasted the violence of his crimes. And what he chose to write about was even more unsettling: blame. He wrote about the women in his life as though they were stepping stones leading him to a ledge he couldn't step back from. He described feeling trapped, pushed, pulled, tempted, as if the decisions he made were not decisions at all, but reactions to forces he claimed he couldn't control. Sean and Nickel, even unnamed bad influences. They all became characters in a script he was rewriting from the inside, a script where he wasn't the villain, just the man who stumbled at the worst moment possible. For a man serving multiple life sentences, accountability should have come naturally. Yet his letter slid in the opposite direction, toward excuses, toward emotional manipulation, toward a story designed to soften his reflection in the mirror. He spoke of feeling weak, overwhelmed, guided down a dark path, as though acknowledging his actions but absolving his responsibility in the same breath. And as more people read the leaked lines, the reaction grew sharply divided. Some saw a man trying to understand his own collapse. Others saw a dangerous pattern repeating itself, the quiet, practiced shifting of blame away from the only place it truly belonged. If you're following this breakdown, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so this story reaches more people who need to hear the truth. The deeper people read into the leaked letter, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a man expressing regret. It was a man reshaping his past. Chris began to describe his relationship with Nicole Kessinger not as an affair he chose, but as a powerful pull he claimed he couldn't resist. He wrote that she changed the way he thought, that she stirred something in him, phrases that conveniently shifted agency away from his own hands. To him, temptation wasn't a choice. It was something done to him, something that supposedly weakened his moral grip until the unimaginable happened. But the most disturbing part wasn't the mention of temptation. It was how he framed Sean and the woman he murdered as a source of emotional pressure. In his words, he was pushed to a breaking point, trapped in expectations, tired of being controlled. For many, that was the moment the letter stopped sounding like a confession and started sounding like justification. A man who ended 3 innocent lives somehow painting himself as the one cornered. Readers were divided. Some wondered whether he was finally revealing private feelings he never expressed before the murders. Others saw something much darker, the same quiet manipulation that had once fooled his friends, his co-workers, even investigators, now being used to repaint his legacy from behind bars. And that raises a question many viewers have debated. Do you think this letter shows who Chris truly is? Or is it another attempt to rewrite history? I want to know what you think. Does this letter sound like honesty or deflection? Comment your thoughts below because different minds see different truths, and your perspective matters in understanding this case. And if you're finding this breakdown insightful, remember to like, share, and subscribe so the conversation continues. As the letter continues, Chris shifts his tone again, not toward remorse, but toward something stranger, almost unsettling. He begins to describe the night of the murders and the days leading up to them as though he were drifting through someone else's life. He writes about feeling pulled by a force, walking through fog, and watching himself make choices he didn't recognize. To anyone familiar with the case, these lines feel eerily similar to the way he behaved during his interviews. Calm, detached, almost rehearsed. His words suggest that he wasn't fully present, that something outside of him nudged him toward the darkest moment of his existence. Some readers interpreted this as emotional distancing, a psychological technique used by people who can't face the weight of their own decisions. Others wondered whether he was trying to craft a narrative where the murders became a tragic accident born from confusion rather than intent. But buried beneath his poetic descriptions was one line people couldn't ignore. I was tempted, and I gave in. Tempted by what? Tempted by whom? That single sentence opened the door to speculation, controversy, and fierce debate. There were those who believed he was blaming Nicole without naming her. Others believed he was referring to freedom itself, the desire to escape his failing marriage and start over. And some argued that he was simply manipulating his audience, using vague language to invite sympathy rather than responsibility. So here's the question. When you hear someone describe murder as giving in to temptation, does that sound like a confession or an excuse? Drop your thoughts in the comments because interpretations vary widely, and yours helps shape this discussion. If you're following along closely, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps this investigation reach more people trying to understand the truth behind these letters. In another part of the letter, Chris turns inward, shifting focus from blame and temptation to the reality of his prison life. His words become darker, heavier, almost claustrophobic. He writes about the constant noise at night, the shouts, the metal doors, the echoes of men who have been broken in different ways. Yet even in that environment, he claims he feels judged, watched by eyes that know the truth. According to him, even among murderers and lifers, his crime carries a different kind of shadow, one that isolates him more than the concrete walls ever could. He describes his cell as both punishment and escape, a place he can't leave, but also the only place where he feels safe. He speaks of pacing in silence, replaying the same moments in his mind, moments he insists were shaped by pressures and female influences he couldn't withstand. It's here that his words begin to feel less like a letter and more like a confession wrapped in denial, an attempt to sound reflective without ever accepting full responsibility. These letters were meant to reveal remorse, but instead they exposed something else. A distorted way of seeing the world, where accountability was blurred and guilt shifted like sand. He writes about missing simple things: fresh air, freedom, the ability to walk without being watched. Yet even in describing these everyday desires, he slips back into a pattern of portraying himself as someone suffering more than anyone else involved in his story. There is no mention of Sean N., Bella, or Cece beyond their connection to his downfall. No acknowledgement of the lives he took, only the life he lost. It's a chilling reminder of how a person can rewrite their own story when the world outside can no longer challenge their version. And if you're still here listening, make sure to like and share so more people understand the disturbing mindset revealed in these letters. Toward the end of the leaked letter, the tone shifts once more, not toward clarity, but toward something unsettlingly self-pitying. Chris begins writing about destiny, about feeling as though his life was always heading toward a breaking point, as if tragedy were woven into his path rather than carved by his choices. He mentions dark seasons, emotional traps, and women who shaped the worst parts of his journey. In those lines, he transforms his crime into a consequence of circumstance, not intention. It is a familiar pattern. The quiet reframing, the gentle deflection, the effort to position himself as a man overwhelmed rather than a man responsible. But what disturbed many readers wasn't just what he said. It was what he didn't. There was no compassion for the victims, no recognition of who Bella, Cece, and Sean and were beyond their relationship to him. Their identities vanished beneath his explanations. Their voices were replaced by his narrative of pressure, temptation, and emotional suffocation. And in that absence, people saw the letter's darkest truth. He was still trying to control the story, just from behind the bars. He mentions that prison has become his mirror, a place that forces him to face what he became. Yet even here, he paints himself as someone crushed by forces he couldn't resist. It leaves readers with an uncomfortable question. Does he truly believe this version of events? Or is it simply easier than admitting what he chose to do? And that brings us to the heart of the controversy. Is this letter the raw honesty of a broken man? Or is it a crafted illusion, meant to soften the image of someone the world already knows? I want to hear your thoughts. Does this letter reveal who Chris Watts really is? Or is it another attempt to manipulate the narrative? Drop your opinion in the comments. Every perspective adds depth to this conversation.